Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Today's guest is the co-host of the very popular podcast, The Corner of Gray Street, Bruce Woodall. The Corner of Gray Street is a podcast centered around the Dave Matthews Band. Bruce and his co-host Nolan are huge fans of DMB, and their podcast dives into the past, present, and future of the band. Although his co-host Nolan isn't a fan of Phish, Bruce certainly is. Personally, my passion for the Dave Matthews Band is firmly rooted in the past, not necessarily in the present, but maybe in the future. Talking with Bruce, I was surprised at how easily I could recall details of when I first discovered DMB, my thoughts about them at that time, and when my fandom began to drift off as they became ever more popular. I was also surprised at how easy it was to discuss the crossovers and commonalities between Phish and the Dave Matthews Band, as well as their long-lasting friendship between Trey and Dave. For today's episode of Attendance Bias, Bruce chose to discuss his first show that happened to be on his college campus, December 5th, 2009, at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville, Virginia. Closing an extensive comeback year for Phish, today's show was a marathon concert that put an exclamation point on a very celebratory year for the band. So let's join Bruce Woodall to hear about how Dave Matthews helped bring Trey back on stage following his recovery, the animosity between the two bands' fan bases, and how to run like a naked guy out of control as we discuss Phish's performance on December 5th, 2009 at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Let's meet today's guest.
Bruce, welcome to Attendance Bias. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
I'm excited to talk about not only the show that you picked, which is John Paul Jones Arena, December 5th, 2009, but also about your podcast, The Corner of Gray Street, because I have a lot to say about the Dave Matthews Band, but I also have a lot to learn about the Dave Matthews Band, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Also, somewhat notable, I think this may be the first guest, the first full-length episode that a guest has picked a show from 2009.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that kind of, and I don't know if that's true or not either. I guess that'll be in our fact check, your fact check at the end. But yeah, I did think about that when choosing this one for sure. And I was like, maybe we can fill in a gap there.
I love when gaps are filled in. And it was, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but it was fun listening to this show because it actually reminded me of really old shows that some more recent guests have picked. Before we get there, let's talk a little bit about you and your Dave Matthews Band podcast, The Corner of Gray Street. So Bruce, originally, where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Grew up in North Carolina, and then actually went to school at UVA. So that's another connection there with the John Paul Jones show. And that was just a few years after the arena actually opened. And yeah, I think one of the first shows there was actually Dave Matthews, but with them being from Charlottesville and all of that good stuff. But yeah, grew up just a few hours away from UVA and where this show took place. And yeah, my parents still live there in North Carolina.
That makes a lot of connections because I remember when I first started listening to Dave Matthews Band, it was a little bit before I started listening to Phish. Mm-hmm. It was probably when What Would You Say became their big first single on Top 40 radio. I was probably getting out of sixth grade or out of seventh grade, somewhere in that middle school era. And they were on the radio all the time. And then Ants Marching came very soon after that. And then right after that, it was all Dave Matthews all the time. Everywhere on where I grew up in New York, Z100, which was the top 40 teenage radio at the time. But they're from Virginia, right? The band as a whole, as a collective.
Yeah, that's right. Dave being from South Africa himself, and then they did form there in Charlottesville.
So if you grew up in North Carolina and then in college went to UVA, how early was it that you got in on the secret of Dave Matthews Band before they exploded to the rest of the world?
So it was actually, I started listening to them with my dad. We listened to a lot of different music in the car, whether it be coming home from work or going to the golf course. I was a big golfer. And so we would always have, he had like a CD case and you would flip through them, included a lot of like Beatles, Van Morrison, Hootie and the Blowfish back in the day. But this will really put me in that 96, 97 timeframe when Crash came out for the band. So that was their second major album and their most commercially successful. But we listened to that all the time. So I could definitely remember the opening to that with the So Much to Say, and they count in like, and they go like that. And I was like, this is weird. And just remember, songs from that record, obviously Crash, everybody knows that, but just some of the other ones, like Two Step is, I think, the second song on that one. And it has this kind of drawn out intro that actually is more of a jammy band sound where they have a lot of stuff going on and really good production with Steve Lillywhite being the producer. But anyways, going along there. Yeah. 96, 97, my first foray into DMB, and, for the most part, continued to listen to them since then. I think that there was probably a several year gap when I definitely thought that I was too cool for that.
Well, your several year gap, mine is almost at this point a several decade gap. It's been almost 20 years since I've been eagerly in on Dave Matthews Band. Like you, I was into the band, like when you said, my first time I saw them was at Jones Beach in 1996. I think Bela Fleck opened for them, if I'm not mistaken, and the Flecktones. And then the next year they played Jones Beach again, and I saw them. And I think that time it was Ben Harper and the Innocent Criminals opened for Dave Matthews Band. And both times, in my opinion and for my taste, that was their peak for before I discovered Fish for me, because like those two albums, those first two, to me are untouchable. Those are the albums of the mid 90s to me. It was a little bit after grunge. It was before I really got into Fish, and it was before like the Spice Girls and a lot of that teen pop became really, really popular. And so there was this period of like 2 or 3 years when this kind of world music mixed with acoustic rock kind of formulated to this really great, unique sound for the time, and became, like you said, commercially successful.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. They have those first 3 albums, and everyone refers to them as the big 3. And it seemed like they progressively got better and better. And it also progressively got darker. I was not a huge fan then. I was very young. I'm 7, 8-ish years old, 9 years old when Before These Crowded Streets comes out. And as they progressively became darker, fans at the time, major fans, are slightly turned off by that. And then now it's like, that's all everybody wants from them. They're like, go back to Before These Crowds. They need to play all of that. And I'm in that camp. But I wasn't really like the huge fan at the time. So I don't know what I would have felt as a child.
Yeah, I remember that. When you're used to Satellite, and when you're used to, like you said, Two Step and Jimmy Thing, and these really upbeat, relaxed, kind of laid back, fun songs. And then Don't Drink the Water, I remember, was the single, I think, from
and like
Before These Crowded Streets.
It's like,
what are they talking about? Like, it's I think Don't Drink the Water was about genocide, like Native American genocide, right? And this band just took a hard left when it's there to, let's bring some weed, let's chill out, let's have a good time at the Dave Show. I remember that's when it started getting a little rocky for me, when people just called him by his first name. Oh, no, I'm going to see Dave tonight, which is ironic because everyone refers to Trey. And I also thought that Carter Beauford, I remember he's what really grabbed me. I think he's the best drummer alive. Yeah.
And being a Fish podcast, it's people will probably argue and say John Fishman or others. Like, the good thing about Fish fans is a lot of times they're okay with saying that XYZ is the best drummer of all, best drummer of all time. Or, they're really, a lot of times they'll be able to accept other musicians and go into other types of music and stuff. But I think that Carter Beauford is a bad dude, and he's the best drummer I've ever heard. So if there's another one out there that someone wants to nominate that's better than him, no knock on Fishman. But if there's another one out there, then I'd love to hear him. And you can throw, John Bonham, Neil Peart, all of that at me. And I think Carter is he's a virtuoso, a genius. And it's like a shame now that he's in his 60s. He's not really slowing down. I mean, there's
God, is he really?
Yeah.
What happened to the last 20 years? I thought he was I thought it's still 1994.
Right. It should be, man. It should be. So that's kind of wild. But he's out of this world, If you really, for those that are listening and you haven't really done too much delving into Dave, then I would for sure check out, the late 90s, mid 2000s for Carter, and even early 2010s he is, and he's still rolling. But there's definitely a lot of stuff in there where it's just like, man, he just never stopped and throws in so many fills that he would never ever play a straight groove. And so now when he does a little bit more often, I'm like, hey man, stop that.
So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on Attendance Bias is because you are the co-host of a Dave Matthews Band podcast called The Corner of Gray Street, which is available everywhere on every podcast directory that I could find. I've listened to a couple of episodes, but for people out there who are listening to this as Phish fans, what's the basic premise of The Corner of Gray Street?
Yeah, sure. So really what I wanted to do, there was another Dave podcast or two, and there I go, I call him Dave. There's another DMB podcast or two out there. And I, really enjoyed them. And obviously I listened to several Phish ones, and then yours came along. So added yours to the list. So, Under the Scales for a long time, HF Pod and, those guys. And so I really wanted to have portions of those podcasts in a DMB centric one, because I thought that there were so many interesting things throughout their history, so many shows that are notable, and then so many connections with other musicians, and so many things that also make them unique, that I wanted to tap into that. So my buddy and I, who've been seeing the band since 2005 or so, we tapped right in and we just started, and we didn't know what to expect. 100 listeners, 1,000, we didn't know. And so we've just been going with that, having fun with it, gotten some great interviews. We had Bela Fleck on last year. And so that was awesome. And just had another musician, Rustin Kelly, on. We have some others lined up, I think, that will be interesting. And now we're going out to we plan on going out to the Gorge here next week and hoping to do some stuff out there, just live from the campgrounds sort of thing. So it's been a lot of fun.
I've been listening to a couple of your episodes lately since we've been in touch, and you are very active. And I'm sorry, what's the name of your co-host?
He's my best friend, Nolan.
Okay. So you and Nolan are especially active when Dave Matthews Band is on tour, as they are right now. We're recording at the end of August, 2021. What are your episodes like in the off season when they're not out and touring?
Yeah, sure. So, in season, obviously, focus on the tour. What did they do differently? What did they do at these shows? And then it kind of depends on how much differentiation was between the shows for kind of the cadence, how often that we release during tour sort of thing. For the most part, I mean, life gets in the way and all that stuff. But as far as off season, kind of like with your podcast right here, we'll try to bring on a guest, go back into the archives a little bit. And sometimes it's just Nolan and I that go back in the archives and pick a show from maybe that week, that month, that day, sort of thing, like a DMB history. So yours, I think HF Pod used to do that a lot too. So we mirror a lot of that. And then we'll have people on, the interview thing. So like Bela, we had one of their photographers and their social media guy, Rodrigo Simas, a couple of weeks ago. And we've had, I think, Matt Norlander from CBS Sports, that he does some music stuff. He's also a big Phish fan. And so we've just done stuff like that, try to do some fun, unique things where we may, play some games, a top 10 list, or, we did a March Madness bracket of things one time, and just try to make it as interesting as possible and just keep people engaged while the band is taking a break. For
someone like me who's been out of touch with Dave Matthews for a while, do you have any kind of entry point episodes that you could think of that could be like, oh, I don't know what they've done for the last 2 decades, but I can relate to this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, especially staying Phish centric. We did a dive into SPAC 2007, where Trey made his first guest appearance after his rehab stint, and Dave got him on stage for a killer solo on the song "Lie in Our Graves." And so obviously, Trey walks out on stage and they're at SPAC, they just go nuts. So Dave kind of lets the crowd just go nuts, and he goes, I ain't going to say a damn thing. And Trey's up there, and then they kick into that, and he smoked it. I mean, it reminds me a lot of a kind of like the peak to like a Hood jam or something, where Trey just really kind of builds it up, and then just, I mean, it's stuff that you just don't really hear too often, because Trey's not guessing with Dave, and, DMB has Tim Reynolds on guitar, and he is fantastic. I mean, awesome, but Trey's just a different animal, and he builds his solos so well to where at the end, where that crescendo comes in, you're just, oh my God. And he does that. And I don't think Trey realized that the song was they have like a reprise there at the end where they kind of bring it back in and they let it fade out. And Trey walked off stage. Now, I don't think he knew that the song kind of continued a little bit after that.
That's funny.
But he was
I
just
believe
like,
that. I believe that.
But yeah, that's a good one. I think that's around episode 10 or 11. So you'll see Spacco 7, the Bela interview. And then I'd say, one of the more recent ones, probably one of the ones from this tour so far when we kicked it off in North Carolina when they came back from the pandemic. I'd say one of those. But I mean, all of them I'd say they aren't too nerdy and fairly approachable. But, if anyone wanted to listen, I would say dive into one of the interviews, dive into one of our show reviews. And then kind of if you wanted to get more interested in some of the specific tour stuff, that as well, as we continue to go on with that too.
So let's shift gears a little bit. How did you first get into Phish?
Yeah. So it was more so I was probably in that 13, 14-year-old range where I was in middle school. So when was this?
What year was this?
2002, probably about 2002-ish. 2002 would have been right. I was in, I think, 8th grade and played varsity golf while I was still in middle school. So I was around older kids, the high school kids that they had different musical tastes than I had. And I played a lot of basketball too. So obviously, golf players and then basketball players kind of have their different musical tastes as well. So when I would be riding to matches and stuff, they'd be playing certain music, and Phish was a lot of it. So I got introduced there, and I'm kind of like, this is interesting. Like, this is definitely different. I didn't really know too much about jam bands.
Right.
And that was kind of like my first real foray into that, I guess. I can't remember if someone just gave me a CD or burned one for me, but I remember, one being given to me, and I started listening to it, and songs that I definitely remember on there were Chalk Dust, Tweezer, I think Waste. Obviously, I think someone was like, here's the biggest single that you could possibly have from Phish, basically.
And one that Dave Matthews covered.
Exactly.
Eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Dave would give a nod to Trey with that AC/DC bag, I think. And then once we had like a talent show at school, and one of the kids played Prince Caspian just on stage solo, just by himself. And I was just like, he's just saying Prince Caspian like over and over. I don't understand what he's doing. I just didn't really know what that meant. And so that kind of made me want to listen to that song. And it was obviously, it's a big difference when you hear someone on stage just saying, oh, to be Prince Caspian, then you hear Phish jam it out. So I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. So that was really my first introduction to it. And then as I continued on into high school and stuff, I met more and more people that liked them. But then we transitioned into where they weren't a band. They had broken up.
Right. So you're talking about 2002, right? That's during their first hiatus.
Yeah. So then they came back, and that's kind of when I didn't really know that they'd come back or anything. But then when I started wanting to see live music, like really wanting to go to a show, like wanted to go to DMB, wanted to go to Phish. Phish had just broken up 2004. DMB was still playing. So I went to go see them in 2005. I was 16 then. So it's kind of like my first, you're allowed to go to a concert sort of thing.
Yeah.
But Phish wasn't touring. So I kind of fell out. They're just a very casual listen at that point, because I'm like, they're done. How am I ever going to see them? What's the point of, really progressing here? I can kind of listen to them here and there. And I didn't quite get why some of my other friends were still so obsessed with them and just like, this, that, and the other. Cause I'm like, well, they're not a band anymore. They're not making anything else. I can't go see them. I can't get that experience that you have probably already had. And then, I guess transition into what we're kind of talking about today. They come back 2009. I'm in college right there at UVA. Can't go to Hampton when they do their announcement. I think we were going to have I think we had a golf trip when I was on the golf team there at UVA. I think we either had that or I couldn't leave for 2-3 days.
Yeah.
We had practices and stuff, but
I was going to ask when you said can't go to Hampton, I was going to ask, well, what did can't mean to you at the time? Because to me, it meant nothing. Yeah. Because there was nothing. I went down for the first night at Hampton. I didn't have tickets. My girlfriend at the time and I had tickets for the third night, but we went straight down on Friday anyway, just because I had to be there. I had to be there, even if it was just going into the parking lot and seeing what it was up to, what I ended up doing Friday and Saturday night. But yeah, there was no way it would stop me. I wanted to ask you about something you said when you were first getting into Phish and you weren't familiar with, you said jam band music. Mm-hmm. When I was first getting into Dave Matthews, they were mixed in with that crew of jam bands, them, Blues Traveler, Fish, the Spin Doctors. They were part of that. I've used this reference a lot on this podcast, but the kind of post-Horde tour, when a lot of bands were making that jump from being an underground scene to being commercially successful. So when I got into Dave Matthews, it's like, oh, they are contemporaries of Fish, who I already love. So when I saw them live, Dave Matthews, they would improvise a lot. Yeah, that breakdown in All Along the Watchtower, it was the same structure, but it sounded different each time. Their set list changed night to night. Maybe not every single song, but you wouldn't see the same show 2 nights in a row. And as it went on, I remember the point where I kind of was like, I don't know if Dave Matthews Band is still a jam band. I don't know if they fit. It was December 3rd, 1998, I think. It was at Madison Square Garden. And maybe it was because it was at MSG. I looked around and there were a lot of girls who were younger than me. And I was only 16 or 17. And they all had these little clear backpacks on, screaming for Crash or Crash Into Me. And I'm like, this doesn't seem as heady anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's when I kind of split from Dave Matthews Band until, like I said, 2002, it was like, it's been a couple years. I'll go check them out again. I've always liked them musically. It was the scene that kind of pushed me out. And I was at my most judgmental anyway. I was a high school student in my mid-teens. So when you got into Fish, did you kind of recognize them as Dave Matthews Band contemporaries, or was it a completely separate road for you?
A little bit of contemporaries, more so separate for me. And then the other thing that drove the separation, honestly, was the distinction between disdain for fans of the other band, the other band by fans of said band. So Fish fans and DMB fans just didn't seem to jive. And I still don't really understand it. I just don't. But it is what it is. And, my podcast partner and good friend Nolan, he's kind of the same way, just does not like Fish at all. Likes the Grateful Dead, loves the Grateful Dead, loves all this, that, and the other, loves the Beatles, loves DMB and all this stuff. And I'm like, dude, Fish brings in all of that into one. What are you talking about? And a lot of times it's, well, their voices suck. I'm like, okay, well, that is it. I can't argue with that because their voices make up about 5% of a show.
Yeah, that's true too.
So,
yeah, good point.
But yeah, I think that they are definitely in that contemporaries kind of thing. But I definitely viewed them, especially at that time when I was younger, as more separate for sure.
When was this show played?
So December 5th, 2009, the fall tour of 2009. This show was the last night of a 17-show fall tour, which included Festival 8, the Halloween festival in Indio, California. And with the exception of Detroit and Cincinnati, which are firmly Midwest shows and cities, this tour, the 17-show fall tour in 2009, focused exclusively on the East Coast. And this tour followed an extensive two-leg, this is in quotes, comeback tour that was the band's first since 2004. And it crisscrossed the whole country, excluding California, notably, because that's where the festival would be. My general impression before I listened to today's show at John Paul Jones Arena in 2009 is that it was basically a recital year. And what I mean by that is they were focused largely on getting their precision back, exploring a little deeper in their catalog than they had since maybe the mid 90s, when, by the late 90s and 2.0, they kind of fell into a routine of picking from a pretty shallow well of songs in their set list. But it seemed like in 2009, they were making a statement that everything was on the table. Any song they've ever played, no matter how old it was or how new it was, and their brand new songs from the Joy album, that was on the table. You could go expecting anything. And that also includes, they played on Halloween, covered Exile on Main Street. Another guest called it kind of an era of expectation, that we all showed up and like, oh, Fish is back. All of Fish must be back. We kind of didn't allow for the idea that it might take them a little bit to get as comfortable on stage that they had been after 25 years previous. That was my big idea about 2009. I fell victim to that. Even though I love the shows, I missed, all right, well, where's the Fish I remember? Since this was the first time that you were seeing them in 2009, where were your expectations in that fall?
Good question. And luckily, I kind of didn't have any of that because I didn't know what to expect, never being to a Fish show. Sure, I'd listened to it, but it's just such a big difference being in the venue, in the arena, in their face, as opposed to listening, through headphones on a CD player or something like that. So I didn't really have any. I was just so excited to be able to see them and that I could walk to the venue from my apartment. So it was just, man, I was good with anything.
And what had you been listening to? You talked about that CD that someone made for you. What was your ramp up on the way to this show in terms of your understanding of them, your familiarity with their catalog, et cetera?
Honestly, I think leading up to it, I listened to Hampton and then Festival 8. But that's kind of what I was listening to because I was like, this is 2009. We're going to see 2009 Fish. Let's listen to that. And then also, I had just stuff from back in the day. And that, like, again, stuff that is a little bit more known. And then like a live one. There were a few of the live Fish volumes that I had too, and maybe like a live bait or two.
Yeah.
But that was about it.
And had you listened to any other like Fish member projects during that hiatus between 2004 and 2009?
I had not. I really just didn't have any clue about any of that stuff. Not even Tab. I knew, obviously, Dave and Friends where Trey played with Dave. But other than that, I didn't know about any of that.
So ignorance is bliss in your case. So when you went, you kind of had that, and this is a good thing, that innocence, that you didn't have those expectations. So whatever they played was good enough.
You got it. Bingo.
So the last question I have for this short segment in 2009, why did you pick this show? Why do you have attendance bias toward this show at John Paul Jones Arena?
Well, I mean, the obvious ones was my first show, was right on campus there at UVA. Went with my good friend Chad, and he had friends from his hometown that went. And I think they were on the floor. We were in the uppers, but we just had a good time. Walked over. I think it was cold as all could be. It may have even snowed or something. I don't know. But I do remember walking back and it being cold. But just having that first moment of really being in an indoor show. I love indoor Fish, but
yeah. When did it hit you? When did it hit you that you were there? I remember in 1998, it was my second show. And in between my first and second show, a whole year had passed. And during that year, I got really deep into Fish, like really as much as I could soak up. And when the lights went down, they opened with Axela for set one. This is December 28th, 98. And I remember when the lights went down, I thought to myself, oh, this is what it sounds like on a live one.
Yeah.
I remember that distinct feeling. When did it hit you that now you were on this ride?
Probably Chalk Dust, right? Coming out of the bag opener and just immediately goes right into, I'm like, boom, well, there's a segue. Like I knew that they did that stuff. And boom, there it is. And that was my favorite Fish song at the time. So that's really when I was like, all right, I'm in. Like they're played two songs I know already, really, really like those two, and they're rocking. I'm in.
And how often would you say you're able to see Fish these days?
Oh man, not very often. And I still am only at, I think, 6 or 7 shows. And really it's just kind of whether it had been priorities or, playing golf for so much time, I would just find my time. Okay, Nolan and I are doing these DMP shows. And then, well, Fish is it's not close. They would skip North Carolina. They would come there. Now I'm in Florida. They don't really ever come here. So they're never close. So it's tougher to get there. I tried to go and do 1 or 2 a year, but that's even difficult just because they do, like their set lists, they kind of hit different places every year too, and don't necessarily stay on that same exact touring schedule. They don't come to Tampa and West Palm like DMP does. So it's just a little bit tougher to hit them for me. If I was in the Northeast, I can't imagine how many I would have been to by now.
You'd be doing a whole different podcast. We'd be competitors.
Exactly. Exactly.
Set 1.
So let's dive into it. They open with AC/DC Bag, which is the consummate Fish first set opener. It was nice and peppy. And for 2009, I tend to give it some guff as a year because I'm there for the jams, and 2009 had notably few of them. But on this audience recording, it sounds pretty beefy. It sounds really strong. And I might take this back a little later, but I mentioned this earlier in that I recently had some guests on who picked shows from the early 90s, like, and I mean really early, like 1990 or 1992. And listening to this show, this kind of sounds closer to that than some years like 2012 or 2014, because people forget Phish wasn't always a jam band. Improvisation was not always their strong suit or their focus. In 1990 to let's say 1993, they were focused on the songs. And that's what I thought I heard here in this show from 2009.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just as a year, I just remember the Hampton shows, there being so many songs from those shows. And it kind of bleeds into this. We'll get into it as we go through. It's like, wow, they played that, they played that, they played that, they played that. Just on and on and on and on. And yeah, I mean, it's short, compact, and great way to really kick it off as far as, the energy's going, and then direct segue. And yeah, it was, I was right in from that moment too. And I knew the song. So that was great.
Right. And then they end AC/DC Bag, but barely, because it goes right into, as you mentioned, a segue into Chalk Dust Torture, which is an awesome 1-2 punch.
Excellent. I mean, if they did, if they do that now, people are still going nuts. 12 years later, AC/DC Bag isn't played nearly as much. I think it was played a lot more in 2009. I can't remember, but it's almost a little bit of a rarity, a little bit more now. I wish they played it more, but Chalk Dust is played all the time, and they'll jam it way out or sometimes have it short. This is one of the more shorter ones as well. But this being my favorite song at the time of Phish's, I was like, oh man, like they knew I was here or something.
Yeah. And everyone probably felt that way. You could hear it at 5 minutes in this recording. You could feel the electricity in the room. I have a feeling that due to its location, there were a lot of people here who had not yet seen the band come back in 2009. There's no way of checking that. Who knows? But it just has that feeling here.
With it being the tour closer, that right. As well, I think had a little bit of the extra electricity too. So yeah, it was definitely loud in there, man, and had a ton of energy. And that was just, that obviously you could just feed off of that. And I think the band was feeding off of it too.
Definitely. They followed that up with Stealing Time from the Faulty Plan, which was new that year. This was the 12th time that it had been played ever. I remember this song. I saw it debut with Jones Beach, and it felt kind of angular, like the crowd didn't know how to react. It was kind of a pessimistic and dark Phish song. There's a lot of lyrics in this about feeling desperate and bitter compared to a lot of other Phish songs, especially. But I also remember that by the middle of the summer, by Red Rocks, fans were already latching onto it as like a crowd favorite. The whole phrase of "got a blank space where my mind should be" certainly was relatable to probably every Phish fan ever at some point in their lives. And I had the thought that this might be a good answer to when people ask, what should I play for my friend to get him into Phish? So far, this show, only 3 songs in, kind of seems like a good answer.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I think that some may describe it as like the jukebox Phish. And it kind of continues throughout the show. It is a great representation of the band Phish without diving too deep. And we'll get into that. But and I think I wrote this down. I just call it "Welcome to the Show, Phish." Like, welcome in. Here you go. And they came in really tight. They let Rock God Trey shine. Like that opening riff to "Stealing Time." Wow, na, 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 na. I mean, that when he kicks it in, it's like, okay, That tone is just so money. And yeah, it seemed like the band, just as the crowd, they were ready to party.
And Divided Sky is next, which is technically perfect.
Yep.
Very much in stark contrast to 2004, when they almost didn't play it because it's an intimidating song. And the crowd makes up for the rest of it. Not that there's anything to make up for, but there's precision, but then there's also passion. And in this case, it felt like the crowd was bringing a lot of the passion and the band was reciting Divided Sky perfectly. And I'm glad in a way that we've reached a point now in 2021 where we can take a perfectly proficient Divided Sky for granted. Whereas back then, that wasn't necessarily the expectation.
And that, listening back to it again the other day, I'm like, man, that was really, really good. And this was my second favorite Phish song. It's one of the first ones I remember ever hearing that was really long, but that had the, song construction that was not just a jam the whole time. It wasn't long because of the jam. It's long because of, it being written out that way. And so I was pretty pumped to see that, and absolutely pretty flawless. And Trey he shreds it. And I think that you put right around that 12-minute mark is when they really kick in. And yeah, Trey was fantastic on that one.
Yeah, and maybe I'm projecting a lot, but that year of 2009, I'm going to keep saying this, there's the idea that it's just the band playing songs, which is also what 1990 is like, or 1991. But there are points here where they're also showing off a little bit, which is what we go to see. That's what we love. And yeah, you called out that 12-minute part. There's great improvisational heights right around there. I couldn't believe it when I was listening to it in preparation for this recording. I said, I would play this Divided Sky. I would mix it right in with any other Divided Sky.
Yeah, agreed. And it's the same thing as, like you said, playing the beginning of this for someone who has never listened to Phish. You're trying to introduce them, and it's just like, here you go. This is a fantastic version. And, far be it from me to find one that's, so much better or something like that.
Right. After Divided Sky, and I'm just going to let you tell this story, they play Yamar. And when I listened, at about 15 seconds, there's a huge cheer that everyone except Fishman drops out. So when you're listening 12 years later, you don't know what's happening if you weren't there. You were. So what happened?
So yeah, right at the beginning of Yamar, this just completely naked guy runs onto stage, and I think he gave Trey a little hug. He ran around, security's coming, trying to get him. He weaves in and out, goes by Fishman's kit, goes around Mike. He does like a figure 8 basically on the stage. And then he got cornered. I mean, he was up there probably a good 15, 20 seconds without being touched. And, security kind of got him cornered. And I think he either got tackled or he kind of gave up. and then, got carried off a stage and stuff. But, Trey immediately just, says like, let's give it up for the naked guy. That took a lot of balls what he just did. And he's like, you're right. It really, really did. But funny story, one of our good friends, Chad and I's good friends, her name was Cassie, and she was actually friends with this guy or knew him from high school. And we either saw her like the next night or next day or something. And she was like, yeah, the guy that was ran naked on stage yesterday? We're like, yes, we were there. She's like, yeah, that was so-and-so. I know him, like showed us his Facebook page or something. And we're like, oh my God, what? And yeah, so she had known him, and apparently Fish bailed him out,
Really?
bailed him out of jail and stuff. Yeah, that was apparently the story. And yeah, he was just a big Fish fan. I think he lost a bet or something, dropped trowel, and got up there on stage.
A couple of months ago, I had the guy who came on stage at the Island Tour with Carini's Gonna Get You. So you're still friends with this person who knows the naked guy. Maybe I could have them both on. It's kind of like a round table, what it's like being tackled by Fish security.
Yeah. And of course, as Fish would and as Trey would, the naked guy comes back in songs throughout the show, including Yamar here.
Yeah. Yeah. He was a naked guy, a naked pa, they say, right?
Yeah. Yep. He
Following
was a naked
that
pa.
is Sneakin' Sally, which is just the second time they played it in 3.0. The first time was at the Gorge earlier in the summer. The crowd reaction to this is great. I always love hearing Sneakin' Sally because there was such a huge gap between renditions of it before it came back at the end of 1997. And now it's become kind of if not a regular, certainly not completely unexpected either. It's not, an amazing sort of rarity when you get it, not quite a bust out. But this one gets really funky toward the end, right after the vocal jam. You're shaking your head. What are you thinking?
Oh, this is so good. This is one of my, and it's another, short one, but it's just fantastic. They nail it. I didn't really know what it was at the time, but just the floor was going nuts. Like you said, you can hear that on the recording. It was really funky, and I was digging that. And then when they come out of that vocal jam, when they go right into that final, Trey solo, and Mike is just slamming this funky, loud bow, 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 bow.
That's what caught my attention too.
Yeah, it is loud, high in the mix. And I mean, I could live in that part, forever. I mean, that is my kind of stuff. And I thought that was fantastic. And I go back to that version all the time. I love it. I
will now too.
Mm-hmm.
Next up was The Old Home Place, which I'm sure was played specifically for the line that references Charlottesville at about 30 seconds. I never heard that before. I've heard The Old Home Place, and I used to listen to it on tape when they would play it more frequently, but I never really noticed that. It's hard to tell a lot of Fish bluegrass lyrics because Mike sort of doesn't enunciate as well with it. I love it as I do. It's still the truth, but I never noticed that reference to Charlottesville. It must have been so much fun to hear it.
Oh yeah. And that was the thing. I didn't know what the song was, but hearing that, we're like, oh yeah. So that was cool. And the other thing is, another great introduction to Fish. Now we're 7-ish songs in, and we've got rock, we've got funk, we've got bluegrass, orchestral composition with Divided Sky sort of thing. A lot of different variations of music in that song, really. And all of that within those first 6-7 songs. And then I'm like, man, I didn't know what Old Home Place was back then. Now I've heard it a bunch, on shows and stuff. I've dove into so many shows at this point. But then I was just like, wow, look at this just diversity of music from this band. And they don't skip a beat. And they have, there's Mike singing. And when I was a little bit more of a noob then, I knew that they had different guys in the band that sang, but I didn't necessarily know whose voice was what besides Trey's at a time, because I didn't really see them on, YouTube wasn't as popular, or I didn't have any DVDs. So I didn't really know who was who when they're singing the things. I was like, oh, okay. So it looks like Mike, he does the bluegrass stuff.
The next song is Cavern. And if it weren't 3.0, where we knew in 2009, the first sets would be 90 minutes, which is absurd. They don't even play 90-minute sets now. And normally they're almost there. They're like an hour 20 or an hour 15. But back then it was a given that Phish would play 3 hours of music with a 45-minute set break in the middle. But I thought, without looking at the set list, that this Cavern would close the set. I was wrong.
Yeah, I think when I re-listened back to the show without looking at the set list, just let it play, I was like, oh, I didn't know Cavern closed. Like, same thing. I thought that it did for whatever reason. I was like, oh, yeah, I just don't even remember. Yeah, I just remember this song. I mean, I wasn't as familiar with it. I knew what it was, but it wasn't really something that I'd listened to a lot. And Trey and Mike doing their little dance, a picture of nectar, kicking their feet out. And I was like, oh, they do dancing stuff too. Again,
They
I hadn't
do it
really
all.
seen them. Yeah, exactly. I'm like, what are these guys doing?
They follow that up with Funky Bitch, which is, again, upbeat, exciting, with a great organ solo by Page. And they're not even close to done. They still have David Bowie, The Wedge, and then they finally close with Bold as Love. What were your thoughts on the end of this first set?
Well, just, keeping the energy going, Funky Bitch. And then Bowie, obviously I knew this one very well. And one of my roommates, actually, he was just knew that I like Phish, and he would just go, David Bowie. And because he just knew that song, I guess. But that one was pretty great. I remember the lights being wild at the end of that. I didn't really know The Wedge, but listening back to it, I just remember loving Phish's little intro. And another solid one. And then Bold as Love, I just remember being like, oh, wow. This is a John Mayer song. Oh, wait, no, it's not. No, it's not. Jimi Hendrix, because I love that Where the Light Is album and DVD from John Mayer, and he covers it on there. And I'd listened to it a lot at this point, and just in my head, just had it immediately like, oh yeah, John Mayer. That's exactly what I thought of. And I was like, wow, Phish plays this song. And then I was like, wait, no, that's not Mayer, you dummy. But I just remember that kicking in. And of course, I quickly remembered that that's incorrect, but this is a different pace. It's like much slower than the John Mayer version was. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. This is different. And then Page singing again, introduced to someone else singing. So yeah, I thought it was, I just freaking loved it. Trey shreds again, guitar god.
Do you remember how you felt at set break?
Well, first off, I'd never really attended a show with a set break. So this was going to be something different. I'm like, do they actually only set break for 15 minutes? Like Trey used to say?
Right, we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm like, after 20, 30 minutes, I'm like, he's a liar. So yeah, it was a longer set break, but yeah, it obviously builds that extra anticipation. I really like it because it's almost like you're seeing two concerts. So, I'm trying to digest this first set, and then I'm like, well, we've got a whole nother thing. And supposedly, they jam more in this set. So we'll see what happens if they go deep, kind of thing. So I was just really curious to see what was going to happen.
Set 2.
Well, let's see if they do jam deep in the second set. It opens with Tweezer, which is a big time second set opener. That's a statement song. To me, it sounded a little uncertain in the beginning compared to some other Tweezer set openers, but the crowd energy sounds like it's just blowing right through the roof, especially at the beginning of the jam. It's wandering a little bit around 6 minutes once it begins, but it is fun to hear Trey sound so sharp. He sounds very much like a student who just studied for a really big test that he knew he was going to nail, like a smart kid. I don't mean like a kid who stays up all night hoping he does well. He's like the kid who practiced all night for the talent show the next day. It's a little rigid, whereas now he's a little more relaxed, like in 2021 or 2019, he's a little more relaxed, and he'll let the jam come to him and the rest of the band. but it really is fun to hear him so sharp. And the other three band members are mostly vamping. Like we're not quite there yet where the whole band builds and builds, what we're used to in the modern day. But that doesn't mean it can't be great when it's pretty much each band member taking turns showing off a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously when it kicked off, I was like, no way. I know this. Like, I know that this is about to get wild. I know that there are versions that are like 30 minutes. Who knows what's going to happen here. And we didn't quite get that by any means, but there's still some nice moments in there. And like you said, Trey was being really technically proficient. And, when I listen to it now, I'm like, oh man, I kind of wish that he was, a little bit looser. Or, allowing something to just kind of formulate as opposed to being formulaic, I guess.
Yeah, well said.
But Mike was really, really good. And I listening back, I was like, oh man, he's bringing kind of a little bit of that still Sally funk here, while still, kind of being that loose background. They never seemed like they really found whatever they were looking for. So I think that's kind of why Trey pulled the plug and kind of was ready to go into something else. I guess you could say maybe a little bit of a little ripcord there, but is what it is. He's like, well, we're going to play another song and we're going to play another new song here. So as they segue out of Tweezer, now I'm looking for more, but I actually like the next song. And I was also kind of familiar with it too, since being new and being on the new album. So I was like, oh, okay, this is nice. I like that.
It's funny that you use the phrase ripcord, because the next song is Light, and I've experienced my share of ripcords into Light. It's like, I've been there, but yeah. I didn't think of that phrase when I was listening. I thought that it was a pretty smooth segue from Tweezer. And any listener of Attendance Bias knows that I don't really enjoy Light, the song, but I do very much love the jams that it leads to.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm kind of in the. I like it. I guess I like the song a little bit more than you then, but absolutely love the jams. And I guess ripcording, as far as it just seemed like it was, they were searching for something. It sounded like Trey was searching for something else. And then he was like, nope, nah, I got this. And then just kind of went straight into it. But yeah, I think that there are definitely a lot more egregious ripcords over time than this one. So maybe we'll dial it back a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that. And yesterday I was driving around giving my re-listen again and again to this whole show, and I couldn't get off this Light. I just, whenever it was over, I started it again. For my money, this is the highlight of the whole show.
I think that's a great point. And honestly, it goes deep enough for me, even still now, but at the show, I remember thinking, kind of losing myself in the song, and was like, is this still Tweezer? I can't remember. I kind of forgot about the song part of Light. And I thought this was like a 15-20 minute version, where it's just almost concept of time was gone. It was definitely type 2 jam. And the last 4 or 5 minutes of this, as it kind of steadily creeps its way, I don't know, it just goes into this like almost muddy, swampy, dark. I don't know. I don't know how to describe it, but it's really awesome.
Yeah. If we're talking about the same part of the song, I wrote that at 12 minutes, at the 12-minute mark, I wrote, it's brand new. And in capital letters, give me more of this.
Yes.
That's because I think it's telling that this show was at the end of a touring year, New Year's Eve run excluded, but it was at the end of a touring year. They were very lubricated. They were practiced. And about a little bit before this, there's a point where Trey stops soloing. He stops playing himself and he just starts playing rhythm.
Yep.
And then that's like a really big turning point, not just in 2009, but in early 3.0 as a whole. And because it leads to the best jamming, because Trey is taking a back seat. I think he is allowing himself to sit back and let whoever else has the idea come forward. And it becomes full band jamming, so that by the time 10 minutes comes by, Page brings in his synthesizer. And by 12 minutes, like you said, it's completely dark, like slowing down, but in the best way possible.
Yeah, it was way out there. I mean, I remember thinking when I'm there, I'm like, this is weird, but I like it.
Yeah,
that sort of thing where it's like, this is my first
motto. It's weird, but I like it. Yeah.
And that was definitely my first time being like, oh, wow. Yeah, this stuff does go out there. This is cool. And I thought that this was a good segue out of this weirdness, because it's like, where do you go from here? That's why I'm always interested when they go that far out. What are they going to do?
Usually play backwards down the number line. But not in this show.
Didn't.
No, not in this show. It's fun you say it that way. I wrote that they kind of painted themselves into a corner at the end of Light. And that's when Trey busts out Piper, which is, again, like you said earlier about other songs, kind of a shorter rendition, but it does have its big highlights into Free at the end of that, which is a little messy, but still, I wanted to hear a soundboard of it because, again, there's a whole band jam.
Yeah. It was definitely, maybe that was more of a ripcord out of Piper into Free. Trey was definitely wanting to play Free. But, that was another one that I knew, was excited to see. And Mike just crushes it. And full band jam. I had Trey and Mike going back and forth. And they rocked that one. That was a good one. But I remember the end of that one having a few of those like microphone high pitched squeaks. And this happened a couple of times during the show. It was interesting. And I'm kind of like, man, that is not something that you hear very often with Phish, or like a band like this. And I always wondered if that like upset the band, made them mad. They never went back to JPJ after that. I'm like, I wonder if this was like a venue thing. I don't know. I just always thought of something with that. And I'm like, man, if I can blame them never coming back to JPJ on anything, I'm blaming it on those squeaks.
And then they play a rarity. They play Sweet Virginia, which was off Exile on Main Street. And I think it's only the third time they've played it. They played it once before Halloween 2009. They played it in New Orleans. So that was in September 26, 99. And I have this feeling that the band was looking for another song off Exile on Main Street, in addition to Loving Cup, to add to their catalog. I feel like after every Halloween cover album goes, they always hold on to maybe two from each one. Like Drowned would be from Quadrophenia, or While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and occasionally Dear Prudence from the White Album, Cross-Eyed and Painless, etc. And I think that at this time they were kind of sorting through their options of Exile on Main Street, and they ended up with Shine a Light, and Sweet Virginia kind of, went off to the side. But there is a reference, obviously, to Virginia.
Yeah,
that didn't dawn on me until after.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the thing. And I didn't really know Sweet Virginia at the time, and didn't really know that Fish played it, I guess. I think, only listening to a little bit of the Indio Fest, the Festival 8 there, I just didn't know it too much to have remembered it and right there to be able to call it back. But yeah, another nod to location that's so Fish, right? And crowd loves that. And it was just a nice cool down, I think, that everyone needed. And then Fish, Fishman sings. And again, it was jarring at first. I'm like, now he's singing. What is going on here? They all sing. Wow.
Really
just kind of one of those things. Just a whole package, man. And you can't get a whole package Fish show, I guess, without them making good references, having weird stuff happen, and then also playing Harry Hood.
Yeah, and long sets.
Yes.
Long sets. Speaking of which, Harry Hood is next. And when I was listening to the show for the first time in preparation for this, I said, okay, I guess the second set is almost over after that big mic jam. And then after Free and a Stones cover, I guess, they're getting ready to wrap it up.
Yeah. And this is, Hood jams are just something that I could live in again forever. I just love them. I love it, love it, love it. And then this one has like this extended outro that you would almost think is like, oh yeah, the end of the show, but they're extending it because they're going to go into something. And it was just another boom, right into Susie Greenberg. Huge crowd pop.
This Hood and Cavern in the first set both completely faked me out, because you're right. They really extend that ending of Hood slam. It's like that first segue that we opened with into Chalk Dust, right, from AC/DC Bag. It's like there's no breathing room. They just go right into Susie, which sounds like a huge party.
Yep.
Huge party. Fish definitely over-delivered at this show. They gave you more than you could have expected, asked for, or even paid for.
Yeah. And this was another thing, another fishy thing. It's glow stick time, right? I mean, with Susie, it's big time glow sticks. So that was the other thing. Floor is going nuts, and they just wait for the massive explosion. And glow sticks are coming down from the uppers and around the floor. And that was another thing that I can remember, and just being like, oh man, I like this.
So Susie would have been an appropriate closer, but no, they go again into Golgi Apparatus, which again could have been a perfect closer, but we're not done. We're on a marathon set, and they actually close with Run Like an Antelope. What do you remember from that closing sequence?
The Mike's bass cutting out during Golgi.
Right.
Another fishy thing, right? Just something happens, and Trey goes, it's a trio version. And then he's like, sing the bass line. And then Mike does, I saw you, and then of course his bass comes right back in at the right time when it's boom and huge cheer. He throws, his bass comes in right at the perfect time. Everyone goes nuts. So that was awesome. And then Antelope, another song that I knew, or at least was real familiar with. And this one, you're just like, okay, definitely the closer now. Definitely the closer now. Yeah. And it was. And then this one is just special because, of course, Trey brings back multiple things. And you wrote down one of them, right?
Yeah, at 7 minutes and 45 seconds, Trey says, Mike's going to make up for the bass he missed during Golgi. And then Mike has a bass solo.
Yeah.
At the very end, instead of I bid you to have any spike or spliff, it says, I bid you to have any naked guy.
Mike's gonna make up now for the bass that he missed the Golgi all
Yep. And then run like a naked guy out of control.
Right.
They do that. So yeah, that was absurdly fun. Everyone's laughing, singing that with Trey. He's laughing. It's just, you can't beat the end of that. I mean, just what a show, what a set. Just tons of songs that I wanted to see that I got to see. And it was just fantastic. I thought that version was really, really good. Trey got into it.
It was a very early 1.0 version of Antelope, ripping guitar, jokes all over the place, crowd enthusiasm, and it closed the set.
Yep, exactly. And you can't ask for any more than that, especially for your first show.
But you get a little bit more. We're not completely done yet, right? They encore with Loving Cup, which is another Exile on Main Street cover. And like a lot of songs in this show, it feels a little bit more energetic than usual. And they close, of course, after an awesome Tweezer with Tweezer Reprise.
Yep. And, with Loving Cup coming, I knew that was a possible close. I knew that at the time that was a song that they did close with a lot. So I was like, oh, yeah, this is the closer. I'd forgotten about Tweezer already. So I completely forgot, hey, Reprise is coming. These days I'd be so keyed in on, I'm like, not going anywhere until I hear Tweezer Reprise, and so that was no better way to close the show. Just all of that. In that first show was just absurd, with a bag, chalk dust, divided sky, that Sally that I didn't really know but was really into. Then you got Bowie, Tweezer, Hood, Susie, Golgi, Antelope, and Reprise. I mean, just it went on and on for me as that. Right, exactly. And as a noob, it's just like, give me more. And I was definitely really hooked.
So Bruce Woodall, host of the Corner of Gray Street podcast, focusing on the Dave Matthews Band, or co-host, I should say. I don't want to take anything away from Nolan, except that he doesn't like Fish's vocals.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on today to talk about December 5th, 2009 at the John Paul Jones Arena in Charlottesville. Before we cut off here, can you just give us a reminder about your podcast, where to find it, any recommended episodes? So we walk away here, anyone who might be interested, it's easy for them to find and listen.
Absolutely. I mean, first off, thanks for having me, and thanks for plugging our show too. But Corner of Gray Street podcast, you can find it anywhere where you do find probably Attendance Bias, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, all of that good stuff. We're on YouTube as well. So some of our interviews do have videos, like with Bela Fleck. Rustin Kelly was our most recent one, another musician. And yeah, you can find us anywhere: Instagram, at Gray Street Pod, Twitter at Gray Street Pod, all of that good stuff. So we are on the socials. Yeah, I would just say try to go find that Trey episode, the one about SPAC 2007. I think that would be a good introduction to how we like to formulate our podcasts, and how we also weave in other bands and other musicians too, and could potentially be a show that maybe you're into and you're like, okay, I like that music. They played some good stuff that show, so maybe you'd like to listen to more. But at least it's got Trey in there. So if you're a Fish fan and all you want to hear is more stuff about Trey, go check that one out.
All right. Thanks again, Bruce. Will do.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Brian. And cheers to all of the listeners out there.
And that's it for today's conversation with Bruce Woodall, the host or the co-host of the Corner of Gray Street podcast. Talking about Phish, going back to 2009 even, which is already 12 years ago, we were bound to have to double check a few things. So now it's time for the attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
Right off the bat, less than a minute in, I asserted that Bruce is the first guest to pick a show from 2009. I was right about that. I have recorded mini episodes about jams and songs from 2009, but today's episode was the first time that a guest and I have gone over an entire show from that first year of 3.0. Thanks, Bruce. For the record, the first event ever held at the John Paul Jones Arena was a performance of Cirque du Soleil on August 1st, 2006, but Bruce was right that the official grand opening was a two-night run by the Dave Matthews Band on September 22nd and 23rd, 2006. Bruce mentioned the time Trey Anastasio joined the Dave Matthews Band on stage at SPAC following Trey's time in drug court. That collaboration was on August 14th, 2007, and video of it is available on YouTube. When discussing the AC/DC bag opener of today's show, Bruce mentioned that Phish doesn't play the song nearly as much as they used to. I wanted to make sure that was correct, so I looked it up, and the band played AC/DC Bag 12 times in 2009 and 10 times in 2010. By comparison, the song was played just 5 times in 2019 and just twice in 2018. During our discussion about the naked guy who ran on stage during Yamar, I mentioned that I had, quote, the guy who ran up on stage during the Island Tour on the podcast a few months ago. I would be remiss not to tell everybody that his name is Jojo Casone, and his episode aired on May 26, 2021. Jojo chose to talk about Loving Cup from November 13th, 1997 in Las Vegas. Naked guy, I don't know who you are or where you are, but if you ever happen to hear this podcast, you are welcome to come on Attendance Bias to tell your story. That's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Bruce Woodall for joining me today, Phish.net for their help with the fact check, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by leaving a rating and a review on your favorite podcast app. Go ahead and tell just one person about the podcast too. Call them, text them, share, and spread the word. If you enjoy Attendance Bias also, reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram. Say hello and I'll send you a free sticker. Thank you all again for listening as always, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.